Good morning. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Welcome everyone to our Thursday plenary session. I'm Elizabeth Ward and I'm the Vice President of Communications for the Land Trust Alliance. I want to thank you all for joining our first virtual rally, the National Land Conservation Conference. And before I introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, I want to, Nina Simon, I have a few housekeeping items. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of our generous sponsors for their support of Rally. I want to note our lead sponsor, the Nature Conservancy, and our patron sponsors, Better Place Forests, Alliant Insurance, Cabana Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation, Finite Carbon, NRCS, Open Space Institute, and Vulcan Materials Company. So this is our final day of Rally. And you should already know how to engage with our speakers. But as a reminder, on the right hand side of your screen in the Rally platform, you'll find a chat box where you can type your questions for Nina. We'll be posting those to Nina during the Q&A session at the end of her presentation. If you experience any difficulty with video or audio, please refresh your screen, or you may also try to access it through Zoom. And we strongly recommend that you view this presentation in theater mode within the platform. And again, I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the session and we'll address questions to Nina once she's finished her remarks. And now let's get started. We could not be more thrilled to have with us Nina Simon. Nina Simon is the Spacemaker and CEO of, By, For All, which is a global nonprofit that creates digital tools to help civic and cultural organizations become more inclusive, relevant, and sustainable. The Of, By, For All Change Network program involves over 50 museums, libraries, parks, theaters, and nonprofit organizations, all taking bold strides to become of, by, and for their diverse communities. Prior to founding Of, By, For All, Nina was the executive director of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, where she led a dramatic turnaround and 8 years of growth rooted in community involvement. In fact, I first became aware of Nina and her work when Karina Mahung shared with me a TEDx talk Nina did on relevance about her experiences at the Santa Cruz Museum. If you know anything about me, you can appreciate why I was excited to view Nina's presentation, as the Alliance is actually developing a relevance campaign to help land trusts engage new audiences. Nina is the best-selling author of The Participatory Museum and The Art of Relevance. Yes, she literally wrote the book on relevance. She's been named an Ashoka Fellow, a Museum Visionary by the Smithsonian Magazine, and Santa Cruz County Woman of the Year. Nina currently lives off the grid in the Santa Cruz Mountains with 20 people, 24 chickens, 3 dogs, and 1 zip line. That is not, that is a real background. She's actually sitting out in a beautiful landscape there. And with that, I'll pass it over to Nina.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you all for having me. As Elizabeth just shared, I'm calling in today from the Santa Cruz Mountains, the ancestral lands of the Amamutsin and Awaswas peoples, and from this beautiful off-grid community where I live up here in the mountains. As Elizabeth said, my work has fundamentally been around cultural organizations, and today we're going to really dive into this question of what it means to create spaces of relevance and true belonging for people who may not have involved themselves with our work in the past. So I'm going to share my screen so I can pull up some slides. And let me get to the correct slides and hit present. Great. Okay, and just my own small piece of housekeeping I'll share is that if you'd like to download these slides as a PDF afterwards, you can go to this link. I put it in the chat as well, and you'll be able to download all the slides to be able to have them. And also so we can stay in touch. You know, while I'm so glad to be with you virtually today, I wish we could be together meeting each other, and I hope that this might be the beginning of more conversations about belonging in these beautiful, important outdoor spaces that matter so much to all of us. So as Elizabeth mentioned today, I run this organization of By For All. My background is working with museums and libraries and cultural centers, which I've been doing for the last 20 years. But I have to admit to you that when I was a kid, this was not my dream. I did not expect to be working in museums or art spaces at all. When I was a kid, this was my hero. This is Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. And when I was about 8 years old, I learned about Sally Ride and I decided that was it. I wanted to work for NASA. I wanted to be an astronaut. Now, by the time I was 9, I had kind of narrowed it down a little bit and decided, no, I didn't want to be an astronaut. I actually wanted to be an engineer. So I followed this dream through high school, through all those advanced math and science classes, and made it to an engineering university to study electrical engineering. And I'll never forget that first day walking into a lecture hall in my chosen major of electrical engineering. You know, it was one of those big rooms with raked seating, about 100 seats on either side of the aisle. I got to a seat, I pulled out my new graphing notebook and my pencil. The room smelled like chalk, and I started to look around at the classmates who were filling all the seats around me. There was something I noticed about them, something they had in common. They were all men. You see, in my electrical engineering program, and in most electrical engineering programs then and now, women made up 1% of the undergraduate student body. There were no women graduate students at my university, no women faculty in electrical engineering. In fact, in all the time I spent in electrical engineering, I never met a woman engineer. Now, I focused, I did my schoolwork, I graduated with honors, and right after college, when I was 20 years old, I got that dream job at NASA. And then I quit it just 6 months later. On some level, I felt like I didn't belong. We've all had times where we felt like we didn't belong, where we looked around and we suddenly realized how few of us there are and how many of them. Maybe you've had that experience at work. Maybe you've had that experience in a community space. When we feel like we don't belong, we're unsure whether there's a place for us. That feeling of not belonging is powerful. It's a feeling that led me to abandon a dream I'd had since I was a little girl. But it's also the feeling that led me to this new dream, the dream that brings me here to be with you today, the dream that we can create organizations and places where all kinds of people feel like they belong. That dream took me 9 years ago to this institution, the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History. At the time, the MA, as we call it, was really struggling for 2 big reasons. The first was financial. When it came to money, we didn't have any. The day I walked in the door as the new director, we had $16,000 in the bank, we had $36,000 in unpaid bills, and there was no magic check coming on the horizon. But at the same time, we had an even bigger problem, and that was a problem of relevance, that there were more people in Santa Cruz that knew this building used to be the county jail than knew it was now a museum, and it had been a museum at this point for almost 20 years. So in the boardroom of a failing museum, this is the question people were asking. How do we get new people in here? How do we get younger people? How do we get people from different backgrounds and races and perspectives? How do we get them in here? I understood this question, but it also made me uncomfortable. I realized I'd heard a version of this question before. I'd heard it 15 years before in university when people would ask this question: how can we get more girls in here? I've come to believe that these are the wrong questions to ask. I believe these questions lead us to lazy and ungenerous answers. You know, in engineering, people would say things like this: maybe girls just aren't cut out for it. Maybe our brains don't work that way. And in culture, people would say things like this: maybe those people just don't appreciate culture or art or history or nature. People have been saying these things to my face for years. We decided at this museum that we were going to ask different questions, not about them on the outside, but about us who were running the show. We decided we were going to ask this: what are we willing to change about how we work to welcome new people? What are we willing to change to help new people really feel that they belong here? And so we started changing our museum, finding ways to make it a place that truly felt community-driven. We started working with new partners, getting different representation, different perspectives in the conversation. We started inviting people to share their own art, to share their stories, to do so in a social space. We started thinking about how to take art and history outside of the building to meet people where they saw history and culture coming alive. We started thinking about how to create programming that brought people together across different races, ages, and backgrounds and perspectives. And most of all, we started thinking about how to invite visitors not just to be consumers of what we had, not to get them into our thing, but to be a space that empowered and supported them, fully expressing their own creativity, their own stories, and their own curiosity. These changes we made were programmatic, they were philosophical, but they also were fundamentally very practical as well. This is what the museum looked like when I came to become its new director in the spring of 2011. At the time, we had this shaky $700,000 a year budget. We had 7 full-time staff members and 17,000 visitors, the vast majority of whom were white retirees and school kids. Here's what it looked like for my final year on the job. That year, we'd grown to have a budget of $3 million a year. And by the way, we'd build a couple $1 million in reserves. We had a staff of 40, and we had 148,000 visitors that year. And those visitors reflected the age diversity of our county, the income diversity of our county, and were quite close on the racial diversity of our county as well. We changed our museum by changing the way we related with our community. And after and as this was all going on, we started looking inside our story for the pattern, trying to figure out what made this possible, which if we were live together in person, I know is the arm that always comes up. How did you do it? And so we asked ourselves that question, and when we came to the answer, it was actually quite simple. We believe we were successful because we transformed our museum to become of, by, and for our community. Our board and staff became representative of the diversity of our community. We worked again and again so that our programs were created and co-created by our diverse community, and that made us welcoming for our community. We started to see this pattern. This was kind of our playbook. And we started to see that this pattern wasn't just working at our museum, but actually was present at institutions around the world that were doing really engaged community work with very different communities. And so in 2018, we opened this website of By For All, inviting organizations and practitioners around the world to share and to really explore and deepen our ability to become not just for communities, but of and by them as well. So this organization I run now, this small nonprofit, is one that equips civic and cultural organizations to become of, by, and for their communities, so that communities have more voice, more agency, more representation, and so organizations are more inclusive, more sustainable, and more relevant. We do kind of 2 things at Of By For All. On our website, we share a lot of free resources, and if you download the slides, you'll be able to get some of those resources there as well. And then we also run a program called the Change Network, where we work with teams from organizations that want to go through a year-long process of making this kind of inclusive change. One of the tools on our website for free, the very first thing actually we created was this self-assessment, so that in just 5 to 7 minutes, you could get a snapshot of where your organization is in being of, by, and for your diverse community. And we've now had over 4,000 people take this assessment, including many at parks, land trusts, open spaces, and botanical gardens. And I want to share with you just a little data from this assessment right now. Because what we see is the challenges we faced at our museum are being faced around the world. One of the very first questions we ask on the self-assessment is this. We say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree, how much do you agree with this statement? Our organization welcomes people of all ages, backgrounds, and abilities. Now, the most common answer across those 4,000 respondents from all over the world to this question is a 5. Most people strongly agree with this statement, and maybe you do as well. But then the very next question we ask is this. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, again, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree, how much do you agree with this statement? Our participants, the people who come, who involve themselves with us, reflect the diversity of our community. Here, across those 4,000 people, the most common answer is a 2. Disagree. How is this possible? How is it possible we could be doing a great job welcoming people, but the people coming in don't reflect everyone in our community? I believe this is possible because saying that we're welcoming is not enough. Focusing, as I would say, on the 4 side of the equation is not enough. If we want people to truly feel like your offerings are relevant, like they can belong in your space, they have to have more than just a welcome sign and a smile. And so actually, to bring my engineering degree in for a moment, we often use this very simple formula to think about this, that if you want to become for the diversity of your community, one of the most powerful ways to get there is to work on strengthening representation in the of category and strengthening co-creation in the by category. And we've seen again and again that that is what can really create a sense of strong belonging. So when you become representative of and co-created by your community, then you can become welcoming for your community, not just on a single day or for a single program, but sustainably and deeply. I want to share a couple examples with you, and I want to share a deep example of this kind of transformation from my past experience running that Museum of Art and History. The story I want to tell you is about an event called Dia de los Muertos. That is the traditional Day of the Dead festival for Mexicans and Latin Americans around the world. It's rooted in an area of Mexico, a state called Oaxaca, and there are many Oaxacans in Santa Cruz County where I live. I want to just note before I start really getting into the story, I'm going to use a term Latinx, which is just an all-gender term for people of Latin American heritage. So whether you use Latino, Latina, Chicano, Chicanx, Hispanic, I'm going to use Latinx today. So for many years, our museum had hosted a Dia de los Muertos festival. 33% of the residents of Santa Cruz County identify as Latinx, and many of them come from Mexico and from Oaxaca, this place where Dia de los Muertos originates. So for us, hosting Dia de los Muertos seemed like a clear way that might be valuable to become for this community that was very present in our county. But the way that traditionally we'd been doing Dia de los Muertos, because it had started several years actually before I came, was not so much an of, by, for approach. The event was run at the museum. We had an altar in the lobby where people could share objects related to people who they'd loved and lost. But the event was run by a staff member, a white staff member, in partnership with mostly white collaborators. Yes, there was an altar. Yes, there was Mexican dancing, but there was also the limbo. This event was super popular, but it was also somewhat culturally appropriative. It was a white event designed to welcome and involve some brown people. But it wasn't an event that was rooted in a Latinx experience. Here are the statistics on what it looked like at the time. So at the time, we had no staff who were Latinx. The event was co-created by 5 partners, 4 of whom were white. And we had about 380 people come to this one-night event, and about 3/4 of them were white. So even on the most basic level, if we're in a county of 300,000 people and a third of them are Latinx, and on our biggest night of the year, when Latinx people come, 100 of them are coming, that doesn't really sound like success. And even more seriously, I've talked to some of the Latinx people who did come in the early manifestations of Dia de los Muertos, and what they've told me about their experience doesn't sound like success either. I once met a Latina, actually I was giving this presentation and a woman raised her hand a couple years ago and she told me she'd actually come to this Dia de los Muertos festival in the late 2000s. And she said, I was always hopeful and excited to show up. But then I'd come, I'd spend 15 minutes looking around and I'd leave. That doesn't sound like belonging to me. So we started making changes so that this event could truly become of, by, and for our Latinx community. We started by recruiting a key partner, Senderos, which is a local Oaxacan cultural organization that focuses on music and dance. We invited them to take the lead, and the festival became more and more created by them as our years of partnership went by. You know, Senderos brought many Latinx artists in. Of course, they brought in musicians, but they also brought in things to really deepen our connection organizationally with the event. For example, they said, hey, why are we holding this event at the museum when your institution runs a historic cemetery outside of town, which would be a much more traditional place to hold this? So now, instead of having an event that happens at the museum only, people meet up at the museum, and then there's a mile-long procession to this cemetery, where there is then a huge number of performances and artistic events. Now, instead of one altar created by museum staff, individuals from the community, Latinx and not, create their own altars in the cemetery, many of them spread throughout, so people really can share their own stories. And now something that started out as just a few hours on a Friday night has become an all-weekend affair between the procession, the performances, the altars, the food. There's been movie nights, there's been sleepovers, there's been dance parties. It keeps evolving. So this event shifted to being co-created by our partners and really being representative of the Latinx experience and stories and loved ones in our community. The other thing that changed about this was who on our staff was leading this event. This is Helen Aldana. Helen's role at the museum, Helen's still at the museum. Their role is as the intercultural programs coordinator. And Helen took over a few years into this evolution process. Now, I want to be really clear that Helen was not the right person to run Dia de los Muertos because of being Mexican, but Helen's background does have a big impact on Helen's skills and assets that they brought to this program. So for example, Helen's bilingual in Spanish, fluent, and many of the partners we worked with spoke Spanish solely or primarily. Does it help when you have a staff member who can really communicate with your partners in the language that's most comfortable for them? Absolutely. Also, Helen grew up in a family that celebrated this event, which may not seem like a big deal to you, but I'll tell you, I'm Jewish and you don't want me running your Christmas event. I mean, I could probably figure it out, but I wouldn't be able to brainstorm and say, oh, I remember I once saw this and da 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 da. Helen brought real skills and assets, and yes, some of them are rooted in heritage, but a lot of them are rooted in an approach to this work. Helen describes the job as creating space for partners to be heard and helping them make their dreams a reality. Together, we made this event more authentic, more inclusive, and it grew to become a lot bigger than where it had started. So here's what it looked like a few years in. At this point, we had event staff who were representative of the Latinx community, not just Helen, but the majority of our visitor services team. We actually, during this time, went from 10% to 50% people of color on our staff, and many of our volunteers were Latinx as well. We were now co-creating this event with many more partners who were Latinx, and the event had grown tremendously in terms of attendance. It had flipped, where now about 2/3 of the people who were coming were Latinx. Now, let me just note, there were a lot more white people coming than ever before as well. It's not like white people weren't invited into the event. But instead of this being a white-centered event, it now was Latinx-centered, and the deep sense of belonging was for the people for whom these experiences were closest. And these results for this one event only tell part of the story. Because perhaps the most important part of this transformation is that Dia de los Muertos is no longer the one day of the year where Latinx people might feel welcome or some sense of belonging at the museum. During this time, we went through an evolution in our staff. We became a totally bilingual institution in and out, and we became a place that could become more welcoming, create more sense of belonging every day of the year. This is a group of Senderos folks after a performance in town coming to the museum to hang out and have a good time with their families. When Senderos brought musicians from Oaxaca for cultural exchange, they told us the first place they wanted to come visit was the museum because they knew we would have tour guides who could lead a tour in Spanish and that the stories we'd be sharing would be relevant and meaningful to them. When people feel a sense of belonging, they don't just feel like it's okay for them to come in. They feel a sense of ownership. Belonging goes both ways. We start to belong to the place, and the place starts to belong to us. So in the work that our Of By For All group does today, we're helping organizations around the world make these kinds of transformations, take these kinds of journeys with their communities. And that looks very different in different communities. We're working with 75 organizations in 11 countries right now, and they're doing so many different things. In Los Angeles, next to the LA River, the state parks partners are really working with Latinx cyclists and families who live very close to the river to, again, create this sense, not just that you can come here, but this is your space. In Minnesota, at Dakota County Library, just south of the Twin Cities, they're working very closely with Somali moms and small children, again, to create a sense that you're not just welcome to show up, but this is a place where your kids can get homework help from somebody who's from your community, where you can check out a prayer rug if you need to pray while you're here, where you can lead some programming and storytelling in our space. And across the pond in England, Streetwise Opera co-creates opera with homeless people, an organization that has been really strong in the BI category in partnership for a long time, but who came to us saying, hey, we think there's more we can do in the of side on representation, and we want to go further. For us, it's a gift to work with these organizations. And what we hear from many of our members is this, that they often start out feeling like they thought they were doing things that were of and by their community, but like most nonprofits, doing things for them rather than asking the community if these were serving them in the best way. And so we're trying to support organizations in making these shifts towards greater inclusion, but also greater relevance and sustainability as well. So in the last piece of my remarks before we go to questions, I want to get really concrete because I'm sure you're wondering, okay, what does that look like? How does it work? And I want to share with you just these 3 steps that you could walk away and use tomorrow or today. So the first is very simple, to just assess where you're starting from. Again, if you want, you can go online and you can go ahead and in just 5 to 7 minutes in this confidential assessment, you'll get a sense right now of where your organization struggles and shines in being of, by, and for your community. And perhaps if multiple people from your team take the assessment, it might spark some conversation about the work that you want to do ahead. The second thing, and really the most important thing often, is to get very clear about which communities you want to move towards. The way I think about this is this, that if you're thinking about building the most resilient, strong organization you can, you should always be thinking about who's going to be critical to making that future organization possible. I like to think about communities as these kind of abstract bubbles of groups of people connected by things that are shared. And every organization has some communities that they already serve quite well, people who already feel a deep sense of belonging. Most organizations also have a couple of communities that they've been curious about, that they've been moving towards, maybe with a small program or an experiment. And what I'm seeing during the pandemic is this. Some organizations are shrinking in to their longest time patrons and supporters, trying to hold on to what they have. But frankly, actually in line trust and in outdoor spaces, we also see this happening, that more people from outside your circle are showing up because they want to be outdoors, because they're hungry for something that they can do that gives them connection at this wild time. And so what I would ask you is, who among the people who are outside your circle do you really want to get to know better? Do you see as critical to the future of your organization? I'll give you a quick example. Last year, I was, and I guess I'll just say that I think that it's really a choice of whether after the pandemic, you're going to go back to having a couple of communities that you kind of relate to with a one-off program versus really building a bigger circle of support and involvement and engagement. So let me share an example. I last year was doing a workshop for nature center directors and asked people to make a list of who do you see in your gray circle, your existing or traditional communities, and who might you be moving towards. And there was one guy from the Midwest who said, okay, the traditional communities who we've really served well at our nature center are dog walkers, our fishermen, our birders. And even when I asked him about it, he said, and there is something in common with them demographically. They tend to be either older couples or older single men. They tend to be white. They tend to be middle class. Great. He has a really clear idea of who's currently feeling a sense of belonging in their nature center. And then he said, two communities we're interested in moving towards, are families and immigrants. And I said, okay, that's very broad. How could you get to the same level of specificity and clarity you have about your existing communities, about these other communities? Because there are a zillion families out there. And what do you mean when you say immigrant? How could we get more specific? So as he thought about it and talked with his team, he said, in our community, we think there's a real opportunity that we're very interested in with Hmong immigrants and with families who have a pre-existing connection to nature. He said, we know there are a lot of Hmong immigrant families in our area. We know that there are a lot of kids in those families. And we also know that we think that our ability is not to reach out to people who have no connection to nature, but people who already have a connection to nature, whether in their immigrant experience or whether in their ancestral land. So I said, okay, great. This is a group you could really go out and talk to. You want to get a specific enough community of interest that if you had a magic staff member who you could say, go talk to 10 people from this community and tell me what's important to them, they could go find them. And when they talked to people from this community, one of the things they heard was of great interest and a deep connection to nature was around foraging. That a lot of these families, not only was it something that they did for food, but it was something that had been part of their heritage for a long time, and they saw it as a way to connect across generations as well. And so this was a point at which this nature center had this classic challenge that arises, where they had to ask themselves, because foraging was against the rules in their nature center at that time. And so they said to themselves, when we ban foraging, are we banning people who we see as critical to our future from feeling like they might belong here? And then they also had to ask themselves, are there activities we're currently allowing, whether that be dog walking, whether that be fishing, that might have the similar kind of impact on the land as foraging, but we've decided are okay either because of a scientific reason or perhaps because those folks have been with us for a long time, perhaps even those are the kinds of folks we are. And so I think when it comes to thinking about how we go from here to here, it often involves us being willing to listen to somebody who's different from us, getting very specific about who they are, listening to what matters to them, and then deciding to make a change. And that leads me to this third point here, which is once you listen, find a way to act. Maybe you listen and it leads you to change the rules about foraging. Maybe you listen and it leads you to apologize for past harm that might have been caused. Maybe you listen and you decide to bring people with different backgrounds onto your board. Maybe you listen and you change whose story is shared and honored. 2020 has been a completely wild year. Where I live, here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, 85,000 acres have burned. And when the world is on fire, either literally or figuratively, there are actions we can take. And my guess is that actually quite a lot of you might have quite a lot of ideas about how to act in reaction to a fire like the one on this picture. But perhaps you feel less equipped in uprisings like this. I'm here to tell you that you can take action when you hear a cry for change. On our website, and again, this is something that you can get really easily, we offer this free framework that our team produced in the moments after George Floyd was murdered, but a framework you can use in response to any kind of moment of outrage and crisis. And there are these two pieces to it. There's the external action you can take, there's internal action, there's immediate, and there's longer term. So just very quickly, when it comes, for example, to Black Lives Matter, maybe your organization took some immediate actions. Maybe externally you made a statement or pivoted some programming or offered support to communities in pain. Maybe internally, hopefully, you thought about your colleagues of color, your Black staff, and supported them. Perhaps you even did some reflection on the role of whiteness in your organization. And then I would ask you, what does longer term action look like? 3 months later, what might you be doing now? Are you deepening partnerships in Black communities? Are you changing policies for access? Are you changing who you are bringing on staff? Who's involved on your board? There are actions that we can take. Now is a time, amidst all this wildness, when we can choose to take action towards the people we most want to belong. If everything's on fire, why not remake it in a direction of greater inclusion, relevance, sustainability, and belonging? I want to leave you in my remarks with a quote from one of our Change Network members, Vishnu Ramcharan, who works at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto. I was talking with him when we had to cancel a whole bunch of events we were going to do together. And he said to me, you know, I'm trying to take what is given and turn it into a gift. How many land trusts are based on this premise? That in a complex world with fires raging, we take land which is given and turn it in a gift back to everyone. It is a gift to rebuild systems that didn't work for everyone. It is a gift to listen closely to those we have not heard in the past. It is a gift to choose to change and take action. Let us choose the gift and the possibility of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. Lots of things for folks to think about, and I know we have questions coming in on the chat. So one question that came in, when you talked about your Day of the Dead program and bringing in crucial bilingual staff members, are they being compensated enough for really helping to transform your organization? You know, she's a coordinator. Is there an inroad for actual career growth to middle and upper level management positions?
Yeah, what a great question. And just to be clear, I have not worked at the museum now for almost 2 years, but we were pretty focused on expanding both the number of people on staff who are people of color, but also creating leadership opportunities on staff and also on the board. There was a lot of board transformation that happened during that time as well. But compensation is a huge issue when it comes to access and to the opportunity for people to really feel included. I'll just say real honestly, at that museum, we did not pay very well. But we also did a couple of things that I'm proud of. We went to pay transparency for every new job that was listed, so we were at least really honest and clear about what we were paying. And we also internally went to pay scales that were really focused on kind of trying to honor the fullness of what somebody might be asked to do. I'll say that in the organization I run now, we've taken a much deeper approach to equity and pay, but it's easier to do that in a startup than it is to do in a changing organization. But to the question, one thing I'd really say, particularly to anybody on the call who's a manager, if there is invisible labor happening on your team, maybe it's that there's a person who you're always like, hey, could you translate this for me? Or maybe it's the person who has to raise their hand and say, hey, that's racist, and potentially suffer the consequences of doing so. I really encourage you to think about what are the ways you might think about compensation that is commensurate with the work you're asking people to do, not just what's in their job description, but what's not in their job description as well. And I'll say that if you're a person who is experiencing that for yourself, I'll just be real blunt and say a lot of white managers aren't seeing what they don't see, they don't see. And so finding a way to do some documentation around, hey, let me show you this additional work or this additional labor that I'm taking on that I think should be compensated. I know there are huge risks to being able to speak up like that, especially during a pandemic about money. But I encourage you to take that one step of being able to make visible what may be invisible to others, even though I know as I say that, that's additional labor to do so.
Great, thank you. So one person commented that in talking about your Day of the Dead festival, that that this event probably became more relevant to even those who weren't Mexican or of Mexican heritage as well. And my question is, what kind of feedback did you get from those people who maybe were there at the beginning and were white, and as the festival evolved over time?
To be honest, in that case, that was an almost no friction one. They loved it, is a simple answer. It had always been a family-oriented event, so it wasn't like, there are certainly many other stories I have where we changed what was in the hallowed halls of the main exhibition space, and there was much more tension about it. When it came to Dia de los Muertos, though, white people who came, were looking to be part of a real cultural experience. Were looking for a way to not be part of something that felt fake. And I'll also say, this is not why we made these changes, but the single biggest donor to the museum when I left was an anonymous couple who came to me after they had randomly stumbled on Dia de los Muertos with their kids. And they contacted me afterwards and they said, hey, can we have lunch? We came to the event. We kind of couldn't believe it. I had no idea who these people were. We had lunch. We talked about a project we were doing coming up in partnership with foster youth in our community. They said, what would it take to really make this happen? And granted, these people were like in their 40s. Like, I was not thinking about them as potential donors at all. And I said, oh, I think it would take another 75K to really make this the best it could be. I got an email the next day. I've never gotten an email like this before from a cold meeting from somebody just saying, we want to do that 75K, and their gifts got bigger from there. And it started because they saw that there was something happening that they had not seen happen in our town before. And that even if it didn't fully reflect their cultural identity, that they wanted to be part of supporting an organization that was bringing people together in that way.
Right. So you touched on this a little bit, but how do you get going on this if there is resistance among your board or some of your major donors? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, there are a lot of different opinions about this. I'm very practical. So my perspective is you want to find a place to start that is likely to you have a way to get started. You can get off the starting blocks, and B, it has the opportunity to not be a dead end. So I actually often say, a great exercise you can do with your board is to list who are existing communities, who are some communities of interest for us. I have yet to see a board that doesn't list a lot of people who they'd love to be involving. The challenge is that board members who might say, oh, yeah, we want those people here for any number of reasons, then the question is, okay, how much are we willing to change to invite those people in? And so I think that if you pick a community to get started with, where you have some connection, where you have some ability to get started, you can kind of get the ball rolling with some early wins and then go further and further from there. And certainly I think that for a lot of board members, and actually anybody who's resistant to change. I'm a big believer. There's this book by Dan and Chip Heath called Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard. And one of the things they talk about in it is this idea that what looks like resistance to change is often lack of clarity. And I will say that, like, what I really experienced and kind of failed at to some extent early on was that I was not sympathetic to people who saw that change was coming and couldn't figure out what their position might be in it, who felt like they were being pushed out. And I learned that their fear of loss was real. The potential for some loss for them was real. And ignoring that or treating them as outside of the change did not help. What helped was having real conversations about that. And I'll never forget talking to a guy who'd been a longtime volunteer and supporter. And we were watching this Friday night event, which was, you know, really full of all kinds of people. And he looked around and he said, you know, I think what you're doing is right for our community. This used to really feel like my special place, and it doesn't feel like my place anymore, but I'm proud to be part of sharing it with others. And I think that that's a very real expression of that mixture of loss and pride. And I think that what was important was giving him an opportunity to feel proud, even if he also felt loss. I see that there is it okay if I see there are a
Yeah,
couple
go.
questions about how do you prioritize who to reach out to, or what if you live in and serve a not very diverse county? You know, it's so funny. So my husband's from North Central Washington, Okanagan County, and we spend a lot of our summer there. And I was talking to a friend up there this summer, knowing this talk was coming, who runs an outdoors organization. And she said, you know, we really have a hard time thinking about diversity because it's not a very diverse community. I said, oh, that's interesting. My understanding is that like a third of the people who live here are Native, and like a third of the people who live here are Latino, and they may not be in, we may be operating in different, living in different bubbles, but it's not like this is a monolithic community. And I do think that in most communities, I was doing something with Iowa Arts the other day and talking to people in very small rural towns where they suddenly say, wait a second, our meatpacking industry is our biggest industry. There are a lot of people who are not white working at that plant. But when we're thinking about our community, they're invisible to us. And that's true for everybody. Like, we live in a divided world. So I think first it starts with just getting real about who actually is in your community. And then saying who is not involved currently here, who we see as critical to our future. And there are some people that who could say that's a selfish or a very organization-centric way of looking at it, saying, hey, let me focus on what's critical for my future as opposed to like what's just. But I also think that from a strategic perspective, if you're trying, for example, to get your board on board, if you can say, hey, everybody around here is over 70, what's the game plan? We need to get some younger people in here. That's a much easier conversation than saying it is morally wrong for us to be a place that is only for people who are over 70. And so thinking about who's a community who you see as critical to your future. And then we often say, get very specific about who they are. So think about how you can get as clear as possible in defining them. And then we use one more filter, which is, do you know at least one person in this community? So if you want to work with, you know, trans skateboarding teenagers and you happen to know some, great. But if you don't know any, you're probably fantasizing about who they are, and you might even be imagining a community that doesn't exist. I'll just briefly note that the LA River example, they talked about how they started out with an imagined community because they were interested in Latinx cyclists living near the river. And what they found was there were actually some very active bike shops and bike coalitions in the neighborhoods, but that they were fundamentally not about cycling. That when they really got to know people at those spaces, they heard, hey, no, this is about community and us coming together. And this is about agency and getting kids outdoors. And we're trying to promote health for our families. And so they thought they were engaging with cyclists, but they actually ended up changing the frame of who that community was to families living close to the river who cared a lot about health and building identity through bikes. And so often you don't even know how to get specific about who the community is until you start listening and learning.
Thank you so much, Nina. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I would happily keep this conversation going, but our next sessions start at the top of the hour here. But I want to thank you so much for all of your great ideas, some really tactical, tangible tools that people can use to get started in thinking about this work, and your experiences and stories. This was an absolutely fantastic session, and I really appreciate it. And I want to let everybody know that the recording of this presentation will be made available on the page shortly, and it'll be available through January 31st. And please take the time to complete the survey. There's a link at the bottom of the page. Again, workshop start at the top of the hour. And Nina, thank you again so much. And I don't know if you want to make any final closing remarks.
I just thank you for having me. And I see that there are a lot of additional great questions. I'll put into the chat one more time that link. I'd love to stay in touch. And if you're interested in your organization going through this kind of journey, we'd love to support you in being able to really make change. It is possible. And I'm glad to be here with you. So enjoy the rest of your rally. Take care.
Thank you so much.